So, all right. So, like Maggie said, I have recently joined UEC, but previously I was working for 3 years on my master's at UCLA, but I graduated back in September. And so what I'm going to talk about today is the research I did for my thesis. That is all about parasites in urban coyotes. But the main theme of my thesis is really what can parasites tell us about the health of an urban ecosystem. And so just starting with urbanization, more people live in cities than in rural areas across the globe. Overall, it's about 55%, and that number is just projected to increase. The world is rapidly urbanizing. And like I said, it's only projected to increase in coming decades. But this rapid urbanization has given rise to megacities. These are hugely populous urban areas with 10 million or more people residing in them. And you'll see in North America, we have 3. In the United States, we have 2. And we'll get to this. Los Angeles is one of them. But because cities are so populous, we often think of them as just concrete slabs that are pretty much incompatible with like a good swath of nature. But the reality is, while cities appear to be really harsh environments that can't support diverse wildlife communities, they're actually the newest and fastest growing ecosystems on Earth. And they support really unique assemblages of wildlife, like you can see here from this collection. And this also includes some large carnivores. So things like mountain lions in LA or bears, leopards in Mumbai, all seem to thrive in really populous areas. In Los Angeles in particular, there's a huge array of natural life. LA is even considered, and like the LA region is even considered to be a biodiversity hotspot. So back to the whole megacity thing, the greater Los Angeles area encompasses 5 different counties, and we'll see that. I'll show a map after this. But it contains over 18.7 million residents, making it the 2nd largest metropolitan area in the United States. The city of Los Angeles itself is only one of 2 megacities in the US, the other being New York. So here is that map of our different counties. The greater Los Angeles area is characterized by a wide diversity of habitats. They cover such a large area. It includes things like mixed chaparral, coastal sage scrub, oak woodlands, riparian areas, introduced annual grassland, agriculture, as well as desert. It's bordered by several national forests, including the Los Padres up in Oxnard, Ventura area, the Angeles National Forest that runs along the upper half of LA County, and then the San Bernardino National Forest. It also contains the world's largest urban national park, the Santa Monica Mountains National Recreation Area, which is right here, where Malibu is and where Thousand Oaks is, which is where I grew up. But this area is home to a diverse group of urban adapted wildlife. And we'll go ahead and take a look at a few of them in my little video. Oh, it's making me sign in. Doesn't seem to want to share on here. So we'll do this one. Dang. Okay, give me a second. Okay, so that was a video of a bunch of birds and possum and raccoon that were all taken at the Natural History Museum of Los Angeles County in their urban nature garden, which looks like a really great space for a lot of different urban wildlife. But if we take a step back, we can see that NHMLA is located right in the heart of LA. It's just a little bit south of Dodger Stadium up here in Elysian Park and downtown LA. And this is the most heavily populated area of LA. And so what that video had intended to show is that cities are really mosaics of built up area, including things like buildings, roads, industrial parks, as well as green spaces and aquatic habitats that all come together to build this tapestry of habitats that encompasses and supports a wide array of community assemblages and species interactions. And so the space within and around the museum grounds may be really great habitat, but it's surrounded by a wide variety of land use types. A lot of this is built up space, like industrial areas, apartment complexes, shopping malls, things like that. But like in this example here, you'll see there's small patches of green space with things like cemeteries even and golf courses that really create just this network within a city of suitable habitat. But within a city, habitat quality, quantity, and pattern can vary widely. So this can create ecological opportunities for some species, but it can also extirpate others. Which brings us to coyotes. They're quite persistent in the LA area. They've really taken advantage of this ecological opportunity that these cities have created. Coyotes themselves are carnivores from the family Canidae, which is the same family that houses wolves and domestic dogs. They're typically brown in color with black tail tips. They have a long snout with pointed ears. And they're about the size of a medium-sized dog. They're a little bit smaller than like your typical lab or German Shepherd. Depending where you are in the country, they can vary in size a bit because of hybridization with wolves, but particularly in LA, they're kind of on the smaller side. They're quite prolific and found throughout the US. Over the past century, they've expanded their range, but what makes them so successful in all these different regions, that's a question. What makes them so successful in all these different regions where habitat varies very dramatically? And so, hopefully, no, my videos are not working. That's very upsetting. Okay, wait, I think I can get it. Okay, I have to switch my share. Okay.
I don't know if there's sound, but is there supposed to be sound?
Yes.
Okay. I think
forgot to.
Share this.
Yeah.
But it works.
It works.
Check up on her.
Okay.
If we can find her.
Keep your eyes peeled because she could just be out and about.
15F is a pretty big deal around here. She and her mate recently fought off the alpha pair of this park. She claimed this scrap of San Francisco for herself. And she's not alone. 15F is one of thousands of coyotes securing territories in cities across North America. They've mastered the art of urban living. But they've also made news for attacking pets, and sometimes even people.
For a coyote that attacked a 6-year-old.
Which puts urban dwellers in a funny position. The coyotes have adapted. Now it's the humans' turn.
So you notice the signal's strong from that direction?
We're on the trail of Coyote 15F with Jonathan Young. He's the Presidio's wildlife ecologist. The outing is basically a tour of what makes coyotes great at city living. First, their basic needs are highly flexible. Shelter for a coyote could mean a fallen tree or the crawl space under a house. Food might mean wild fruits, rats and gophers, garbage, or the occasional cat.
Keep your eyes peeled as we drive by. Sun, water, gophers.
That's all I ever need.
Yeah, they don't need much. They're simple.
Second, coyotes can make do with territories big or small. In rural areas, 15F and her mate could occupy 15 square miles or more. Here in the city, coyotes have been spotted in green spaces much smaller.
You go to some place like Coit Tower on the northeastern corner of San Francisco, it's such a tiny little patch, and they've managed to really carve out their residency there, and have seemingly are thriving in that area.
And finally, they're really fucking hard to find. There are likely dozens of coyotes trotting around the city day and night, but most of the time, you'd never know it. After an hour of searching for 15F, even with a tracking device, we've got nothing.
That's it.
That collar is off until 9 a.m. tomorrow morning?
Yes.
The coyotes living in San Francisco are here because of a truce. They're common in this part of the country, but they disappeared from the city around the 1920s. Here and elsewhere, they were seen as pests and threats to livestock. Trapping, poisoning, and bounties were commonplace. But across North America, coyotes have been on a tear. Their range has grown dramatically since 1900. This is one study's estimate. Ironically, it's human expansion that's helped. People wiping out apex predators like wolves and clearing land, which coyotes prefer to forests. So more and more coyotes found themselves mingling with people. And people came around. Attitudes shifted in the 1970s toward animal rights and conservation. Many cities, San Francisco included, began focusing on coexistence. And slowly, they came back to San Francisco. First to the Presidio in 2003, then to parks across town. It's a truce, and it's held.
That's for sure. Okay, so coyotes are really great at living among humans. Like the biologist in that video said, they're pretty simple. They don't need a whole lot to be happy. They're a generalist species, meaning they aren't really picky about the food that they eat or where they live. And because of this, they so easily adapt to living in cities and even benefit from a close association with humans. In LA, they've made themselves quite comfortable, sleeping on patio furniture, raising their pups under people's decks, eating fruit off native and ornamental plants and trees, and even occasionally grabbing a slice. But how do coyotes relate to parasites and ecosystem health? Well, we'll get there eventually, but let's take a moment and just scale down, and we'll talk about parasites, which means I have to switch back to my one.
Okay. In biology, a parasite is an organism that benefits at the expense of another species, its host.
Did that share with audio?
Yes.
Okay, cool.
Okay. In biology, a parasite is an organism that benefits at the expense of another species, its host. Parasitism is a behavior in a relationship. It's a way of life. But it's not a single group of organisms, like how furry things with mammary glands are all mammals. They're amazingly diverse. One study estimated as many as 40% of known species are parasitic. Some are visible to the naked eye, and some are so tiny that you need an electron microscope to see them. Parasites that live on the host body are called ectoparasites, like lice, fleas, and mites. There are others that occasionally feed on their host, like mosquitoes and leeches, and many that live in the body, like helminths, the parasitic worms, which includes flatworms like tapeworms and flukes, and nematodes, also known as roundworms. Just to give you an idea of the diversity of these parasitic animals, one study determined there could be as many as 300,000 different species of parasitic worms alone. That's possibly 4.5 times more parasitic worms than all vertebrates, every bird, fish, turtle, and mammal species on the planet combined. And by estimates in a recent paper, as many as 30% of these parasitic worms and 10% of global parasite diversity are committed to extinction due to things like climate change-driven habitat loss by the year 2060.
Okay. So that's not what I'm going to do. So what is a parasite? So a parasite is one who eats at the table of another. In other words, parasitic organisms are organisms that live in or on another organism and benefit by deriving nutrients at the host's expense. Like was said in that video, they are hugely diverse, and virtually every living thing on the planet carries some type of parasite. Parasite is a widely encompassing term that can refer to the type of parasite like I've shown here, like tapeworms and ticks and malaria. But it can also include things like viruses and bacteria. Today, what we're going to focus on are the tapeworms and the ticks, more the tapeworms. But like was said in the video again, they fall into two classes: ectoparasites, endoparasites. Ectoparasites live outside, endoparasites live inside. My research itself focuses on endoparasites, specifically intestinal worms, such as tapeworms and nematodes, like these parasites here. The parasites I study generally follow this life cycle. Eggs existing in the environment are ingested by a host, in this case, our coyote. The eggs hatch and worms mature in the intestine, and then the ingested parasite reproduces within the host, and the infected animal sheds eggs through their feces. Eggs can survive in the environment for weeks at a time before being ingested by a new host. This is a direct life cycle, but some parasites that I study are a bit more complex and require multiple hosts in order to complete their life cycle. In this case, eggs are ingested by an intermediate host, in this case, our rabbit. But in order to complete the life cycle, the parasite needs their intermediate host to be consumed by their definitive host. So this is called trophic parasitism, where our infected intermediate is then consumed by the definitive host, and then the worms mature in the intestine and the cycle starts over. Sometimes parasites need more than 2 intermediate hosts, and things can get even more complex. But this complexity really sets the stage for them being really useful in determining ecosystem health. And so we have one more video.
them. So you can make the argument that parasites are diverse and inherently interesting, but aren't they ultimately bad for their hosts? Well, these relationships are complicated. It's true that some can wreak havoc on unwitting hosts, especially if that parasite isn't suited to the host's physiology. And that's because many parasites have co-evolved alongside their hosts for thousands to millions of years and are adapted to the host-parasite relationship. But problems can arise when these co-evolved parasite-host interactions become disturbed and a parasite seeks a new host environment, one that it's not adapted to. And now, with climate change altering the distribution and habitat ranges of many wild animal populations, parasitologists are wondering, how will this impact the parasites of those animals? Parasites truly are crucial to the structure and function of their ecosystems, and they play important roles in the food chain. One study estimated that 60% of the endangered Japanese trout's annual diet comes from eating grasshoppers that were driven to jump into headwater streams due to a nematode parasite in the insects, one that requires the grasshopper to seek water so the worm can complete its life cycle. For better or worse, parasites can regulate wildlife populations. A species of gut tapeworm is now the leading cause of deaths in giant pandas, and they've begun evolving drug resistance. It's one that conservation scientists are actively studying to learn more about how these worms evolve, which is going to be necessary if they hope to find a treatment for the pandas. But maybe the best case in arguing for the preservation, study, and de-vilifying of wildlife parasites is that studying parasites and emerging diseases are two sides of the same coin.
Parasites are up to 80% of the food web links in the ecosystem. So they're kind of puppeteers. They're interacting with each other, and they might be the glue that holds some ecosystems together. What we think could be happening if parasites are going extinct in some ecosystems, that might make it easier for others to invade and cause disease and generally kind of get out of control. It's a lot like when you lose a top predator, like a wolf in an ecosystem, and then the deer population skyrockets. We think similar things could happen with parasites.
Humans, even though we always do this, we shouldn't pass judgment values on species. If we're working to conserve and study the diversity of life on this planet, that doesn't just go for tigers and pandas. That goes for their parasites too.
So parasites are a really crucial part of the ecosystem, as was mentioned in the video. And like I said previously, with our more complex life cycle dynamics, they really mediate a lot of species interactions within a food web in a bunch of different ways, one of them being trophic. But removing them can cause really detrimental effects to an ecosystem, like removing gray wolves in Yellowstone. It keeps the system in balance, and without them, there's the potential for a single wildlife species to dominate or for other infectious disease to invade. Infectious disease more generally are really important because they regulate population sizes by weakening or killing off species that are seen as less fit, or influencing the ability of their hosts to reproduce. They also mediate species interactions, like how some parasites need their host to be eaten in order to complete its life cycle. They can also influence susceptibility to other infections by weakening the immune system, making them more susceptible, or by outcompeting other parasites for space, making it less susceptible. Urbanization can fragment the natural landscape, causing disruptions in the food web and a loss of biodiversity. There are plenty of species that love urbanization, but if you think about what you see out in the city versus what you might see in like a wildlife preserve, there's a lot of things missing. And so having parasites is a big part of that. Like I said, parasites are major players in driving population dynamics and maintaining wildlife diversity. Anthropogenic land changes can alter these relationships, leading to zoonotic spillover, or the transfer of wildlife pathogens to humans. So all these concepts are tied together by this concept of One Health. Human health, animal health, environmental health are all intertwined and dependent on each other. So understanding coyote health in the case of my research, has implications in both ecosystem health and human health. So getting specifically into my research, my project is really focused on intestinal helminths, including tapeworms, nematodes, and trematodes or flukes. It's aimed at describing the variation in diversity and infection intensity of these parasites across an urban landscape. So this goal is really driven by these two questions. So first, what is even present in Los Angeles? And second, how do patterns of parasitism vary with levels of urbanization? So what I wanted to know was first, what parasites do coyotes in this area even carry, and how many parasites do individual coyotes carry? Studies on coyote parasitism have been done across the country, but no study has ever been conducted in LA specifically, and few studies really focus on urban parasitism. But then getting into how patterns of parasitism vary, it's really important that we have that baseline of what's even here before we look at differences. But once we know, we want to know, are there disease differences across an urban to rural gradient? And then what does this specifically, what do those patterns tell us about biodiversity within an urban system and about ecosystem health? And so how I did this was working with local wildlife management agencies to collect coyotes for necropsy. And I would collect intestinal content during these necropsies. Later, I would go back and look at it under a dissecting microscope. And then we count all the helminths, we identify all of them, and then we take these prevalence and intensity measures, and they're mapped against urbanization indices. And so I've spared you some of the grosser pictures that I've collected over the years. But essentially what we do is we take roadkill or culled animals that are provided by project partners and necropsy them. And so what I got from that is we have about 40 animals, split pretty evenly between females and males, a lot more adults than juveniles. And they came from all across the greater LA area, from varying levels of urbanization, some right in the heart of Santa Monica Mountains, some are more agricultural, like this one out here. But then we have a good handful that are living in fairly urban areas. Once we necropsy the coyotes, intestinal content is removed and preserved in ethanol. And then later on, I go through and under a dissecting microscope, pull out any adult helminths, store them in little glass vials and count them and try to identify them. Identification was done a couple different ways, either through morphological identification with the help of some experts, or through genetic confirmation. And what I found is that the majority of the coyotes that I sampled were infected with at least one parasite. In fact, 80%. A few coyotes had really high intensities, like this one out here, so it has above 300 worms. But overall, I collected 1,243 individual parasites. And what I found in terms of tapeworms was I found possibly 4 different species. We have this Tania species, which is a rabbit tapeworm, one of those worms that require a more complex life cycle where a rabbit is first infected and then a coyote. Then we have this parasite, which is called flea tapeworm, where the flea is the intermediate rather than the rabbit in this case. And then we have Mesocestoides. Mesocestoides life cycle, there's a lot of species. They're very difficult to identify, and their life cycles vary a lot. With the help of genetic identification, this rabbit tapeworm here was split into two possibly distinct species. We don't know exactly what species, if it's a new species, if there's just a little bit of genetic variation between them, but in my results, they're referred to as species 1 and species 2. In terms of nematodes, I found a couple of tapeworms that are more closely related to domestic animals, like this Toxicara and the Toxcaris, as well as this Encyclostomia. These two are hookworms. Untenaria is a more natural parasite, but a few that are more closely associated with domestic animals. And so looking at prevalence, what I found was that rabbit tapeworm, species 1, untyped, meaning that it didn't get genetic sequencing, and species 2 were extremely prevalent throughout the study area, with several of the other parasites being a bit less common. In terms of intensity of infection, we have a pretty even distribution when you remove anyone that wasn't infected with anything. Between all the different parasites, it's pretty spread out, with most individuals being infected with only a few, and then a few individuals being really, really heavily burdened with like over 300 or closer to 200 worms. So what did we learn from this in terms of my first question and goal? What we learned is what they carry. We established that baseline. We have prevalence numbers. We have a general idea of what's even present. And so this is a good jumping off point for looking at how urbanization may impact this parasitism. And so what I did from there was take these prevalence and intensity metrics from the data that I collected, the count data that I collected, and mapped them onto urbanization indices. What I used as a proxy for urbanization is impervious surface. Impervious surface essentially means surfaces that are impervious to water, material that are typically artificial, things like asphalt, concrete, brick, stone, and even compacted soil are less capable of soaking in that water. And so in urban areas where there's more impervious surface, we have a lot of runoff rather than it soaking into the ground. And this is a good proxy for urbanization because it essentially tells us where really built up areas are and where more natural ground cover is. And so this is what each coyote location looks like in terms of impervious surface. We have a good distribution where the red is more impervious surface, the darker blue is less. We have a good mix here. And so when I looked at the two groups that I found, tapeworms and nematodes, this is what the distribution looked like. With increasing urbanization, I found that the presence, meaning just whether or not they're there, was found to be negatively associated with increasing urbanization. So these couple individuals that weren't infected with anything typically came from more urban areas. Additionally, the intensity of infection, meaning the more individual worms that were found in a coyote, were found to be negatively associated as well for nematodes. Cestodes, there isn't really a clear pattern, but if you look at the green You can see the nematodes generally fall in more rural areas, and that intensity of infection was found to be associated with that decreasing levels of urbanization. When separated out into species, cestodes didn't really show any interesting patterns. They're kind of just everywhere. But when we look more closely at nematodes, one nematode in particular was more likely to occur in less urbanized areas, and that is the Spinsonaria, the dark red. This is the one parasite that is typically found infecting more wild populations, whereas the other 3 plus some ones that I wasn't able to identify to species are the ones that are more typically associated with domestic animals. And so getting into the questions from this understanding how urbanization impacts parasitism, first, are there even disease differences? And the answer is yes. What we saw was that coyotes living in areas with less impervious surface were more likely to be parasitized regardless of the life history strategy of that parasite, meaning whether or not the life cycle was direct or complex. Parasites that had both direct and complex life cycles more likely to be found in less urbanized areas. But what does this tell us about biodiversity and ecosystem health? We can only really speculate based on the patterns we saw, but it seems that parasites that employ more complex life cycles are often absent from urban ecosystems. And one really clear example of this is the absence of flukes in my study, or trematodes. Trematodes are one of those parasites that need multiple intermediate hosts in order to complete their life cycles. They require a snail intermediate and then a tadpole or fish intermediate typically before they are consumed by a bird or mammal or reptile as their definitive host. What we know is their definitive host is around, and in theory, some of these intermediates are around, but why aren't they getting infected? The lack of flukes here might suggest there's a lack of intermediate hosts, specifically amphibians. Urban areas typically have way less amphibian biodiversity, and reliable sources of water can be difficult to find, especially in cities like LA, where we see very little rain throughout a typical year. It's also very clear that there are less parasites generally in more urban areas. We found both cestodes and nematodes to be negatively associated with increasing levels of urbanization, which brings us back to what was said in one of our earlier video clips. Parasites are really important in keeping an ecosystem in balance. Most organisms have at least one parasite that they can become infected with. But because these parasites are typically very specialized and have co-evolved alongside their hosts, their impacts in terms of the host biology, host life history is typically far less severe. The lack of natural parasites that we would expect to see in any given population may indicate a lack of a well-connected and balanced food web, which can leave wildlife and human populations vulnerable to invaders. Parasites are a natural part of any ecological community, and their prevalence, their presence, diversity, and abundance provide vital insights into the overall biodiversity, structure, and function of an ecosystem. The role they play in natural populations is, in a way, servicing us. A biodiverse system provides all kinds of benefits, from things like climate regulation to food production, pollination, and just its intrinsic value. Parasites are a part of that. having natural parasites not only keeps the system balanced, but it protects us from potentially harmful infectious disease. As we've seen, a lack of parasite biodiversity not only is indicative of a lack of wildlife diversity, but it also suggests that populations might be vulnerable to invasive infectious diseases. So maintaining a biodiverse ecosystem, especially in urban areas where we are coexisting with wildlife, is crucial in protecting us from zoonotic spillover, as well as maintaining these other ecosystem services. And so that's it. Hopefully you learned something cool about parasites. But thanks for letting me share all of that. And I can take questions now.